Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and LEAP, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with Test School and Life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to test and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is the most common neuromyths. But first, let's meet our special guest, Gretchen Wegner.
Gretchen Wegner is the founder of the Anti-Boring Learning Lab, where educators obsess over discovering the best science-backed study skills and executive function strategies every student needs to thrive. A former classroom teacher and academic coach, she now specializes in consolidating the science of learning into fun, digestible, actionable, executive function-friendly nuggets for educators and their students. Gretchen is also a tireless learner, consistently and transparently modeling the anti-boring study skills toolkit in her speaking presentations and throughout her courses and community. Welcome.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here.
Gretchen, we are so happy to have you here. 2024 has been a great year because we've seen a lot more of you this year than we have. Though the first time you were on the show was back in episode 34. All the way back in the archives to talk about how to teach students to learn.
We're well over 600 now, so this is a long journey.
Good.
I mean, you were on more recently when we put a spotlight on the Anti-Boring Learning Lab, but even since then, much has changed in your busy life, right?
It's true. Yes.
We'd love to hear a bit about it.
Yeah, well, I am getting just more and more clear about what exactly the anti-boring learning lab is all about. And by the time you all hear this, we'll have a beautiful update to our website. So please head over to that. We're really focusing on serving academic coaches, test prep professionals, those of us who work in the quirky corners of education. And this landscape, there's a lot that stays the same and there's a lot that's changing in it, right? Post-COVID. So anyway, I'm just so excited about all of the pieces we have for that, including there's even now a free membership level. So head on over to antiboringlearninglab.com if you're curious to check that out.
Very cool. So, recently you spoke at an NTPA summit and we were talking about a lot of different things, but you mentioned neuromyths and common neuromyths and the idea of like neuromyths and what they are and how prevalent they are always stands out for us as educators. And when you said it, we were like, oh, we've got to talk to Gretchen and have her explain what a neuromyth is and some of the ones that we all, teachers and learners alike, need to look out for. So let's start the conversation, Gretchen, with just lay out, what do you mean by neuromyth?
Yeah, well, neuro suggests the brain, right? And myth suggests something that's not true that we all think is true. And ever since brain research there has been more and more and more of it, educators, and myself included, jump onto ideas that seem like, oh my God, that's really interesting, that's really helpful, or that I understand myself better when I hear that, or I understand kids better when I hear that. And then we jump on that bandwagon. We believe it, we share it. And so often that information, it's not that it's not necessarily true, but it's been taken out of context and actually shouldn't be applied to education, to teaching and learning the way the culture really has applied it.
Well, it's funny because as a psychology major, I learned decades ago what we're learning all the time in education, which is that so much of what we think we know about the brain or behavior or learning is based on really small, non-scalable studies. But as soon as something hits the headlines, everybody repeats it endlessly because we're trying to grab onto some certainty when it comes to something that is very hard to understand, which is the human brain.
Yeah. Well, I want to throw out there, just kind of having been an education major myself and obviously being a woman of a certain age, I think about some of the things that I was taught when I was in an education program. So I put myself in sort of the place of other parents out there who might be of a similar age range, who might have thought, oh, I learned this in college. So we operate on what the information that you think you have, and then you realize unless you sort of update, you may not, there's more current information that certainly you've been sharing with the community over these last few years.
Mhm.
So I'm curious with these neuromyths we're going to talk about and you've researched, is there one of them that you feel like stands out above the rest? That is like the most significant neuromyth that you hear of or see people talking about?
Well, yes, and I'm smiling right now, even though people can't see that, because I actually remember the moment I learned about Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences theory. And I remember where I was sitting. I was at a theater company that I worked at, and we were in our staff training. And I remember the feeling of sparkle, like this explains everything. And the kind of teacher and coach I am now, including the anti-boring part of what I do, is built on this wonderful theory that actually is very helpful in one regard, but it's also based on the neuromyth that if we learn according to our learning style, we will learn better.
Right. And that's how I was taught. I was taught that that's the point would be to find out what your learning style is and to make sure that you engage using that particular modality. I think like you, I thought for myself as a learner, when I learned that, like that was like a revelation. And yet I can look on my sort of educational path and realize there are many times in situations where the most effective sort of study skill or habit I used did not subscribe to what my technical like learning style was, right?
Totally.
Gretchen, this reminds me of this wasn't that long ago, but your Art of Motivating Students Summit. Remember in the chat, somebody
Yes.
brought that up and I shot
Yes.
them down. And then
Yes.
like, I didn't shoot them down, but somebody was like talking about learning styles and really embracing them and like she let off with, I know this is controversial, but I'm totally down with this. And other educators are like, well, that's actually not supported by research.
Yes. Yeah. And let me say something about that, because who knows, that person might be listening right now to us.
And she said she gets great results. She's like,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter. And I think she refined what she was saying, but
Yes.
that's because we all have the sense of the difference between learning styles, the way you actually learn, or learning preferences, the way you'd like to learn.
Right. And so exactly the way she works on coaching her students, I know more details about it. It is brilliant. She gets results. And the great thing about learning styles, which is why my own eyes sparkled when I first learned about it, is it helps us understand ourselves better. Oh, I do feel happier when I move my body when I'm learning. Oh, I do feel better when I'm just not getting a lecture auditorily, because I am so not an auditory learner. And that's the phrase we all say, right? I am or I am not a blank learner. And that's never going to leave the culture. And I think it's okay to say that. But it is important for me to hear things auditorily as well as do all kinds of other things. But when I'm not motivated to learn, starting with my preference is a good thing to do, is anti-boring. And so that's where that particular person, if she just didn't use the word styles and use preferences instead, her work would be so wonderful and accurate according to the science.
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing is to understand there are different learning modalities, right? Like there are different ways in which we can encode information, right? But the idea would be that to sort of only stay in one lane, is where the myth occurs. To think I have to stay in this lane at all times, and that's just simply not the truth, right?
Right. I'm doing a good job studying for my finals or preparing for that test if I'm moving my body the entire time. That's the part that's not true, even though kinesthetic is one of my preferences. Can I get a little nerdy with you all for a second and tell you some of the origins of why we believe this so strongly? And I just learned this morning. So this is my first time getting to practice saying it out loud. But in the 70s and 80s, two things occurred at the same time. A growing amount of research that was scientific research related to how we learn, and teacher training shifted, and marketing became more a part of how teacher trainers got the word out about themselves. It was also a time when schools were trying to, what's the word when you try to get everybody do the same thing in the same way?
Systematize?
Yeah,
Yeah.
systematize is a good one, but schools were
Standardize?
trying
Standardize.
standardize. That's
Yes.
it.
That's a big
Standardized
word in our
teaching.
vocabulary.
Yes, tis true. So I'm just fascinated that those two things happened at once. So in the scientific arena, there were people like David Kolb's experiential learning theory work. That was in 1971. And I'm reading from some of my notes here since this is new, but he categorized learners into 4 styles based on a cycle of first we experience, then we reflect, then we conceptualize, and then we experiment, right? That's experiential learning theory. And so that was the first time of like seeing things like, oh, put into these sections. And I should say the first time in Western learning theory.
Yep.
I'm sure there are others in other places
Might
in
even
the
be
world.
worth saying modern education.
Modern Western. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And then in 78, Rita and Kenneth Dunn came up with a learning styles model that basically said that we should tailor instruction based on the physiological, the environmental, and the emotional learning preferences. So they used the word preference then.
Right. They
Interesting.
did. They were. Okay, keep going because you bring up like such an interesting point there.
Yeah. I'm not going to go through all of them. I've got a list of studies right now, but it really is from about 71 to 1987 is when Neil Fleming came up with the VARC model that all of us know so well. That particular coach we were referring to earlier, she teaches based on the VARC model, and it classifies us into visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic learners. Despite the limited evidence for its effectiveness, the research showed, but it was there.
And that's the thing, right? Is that the origins, you trace the origins back to, they describe it as preferences, but then there's a difference, I think, between real psychology and pop psychology.
Yeah.
And once somebody gets a hold of it and wants to create a marketable, saleable product based on it,
And digestible.
That's when they transform.
But for people, anybody out there, they can understand that because they can relate it to themselves. And all of a sudden they see something in themselves, which sort of green lights, which validates it, I think it's interesting that what you're saying is a lot of that research was coming out really right upon when I was entering college in education.
Right.
So that makes sense that that's how I was trained.
Yeah. Well, and it was also a time when we were shifting how we saw what the role of schools were. Like from the industrial era on, schools were to help create more factory workers, and we wanted everything to be the same. The bells went right to train people how to get up and change their work when they hear a bell. We wanted everyone to learn in the same way. And this was a good 50, 60 years after that when we were suddenly like, wait, we should individualize learning.
Right.
And that's a good impulse.
That's exactly what this led to, is recognizing not all students are the same. And so we want to start to differentiate our instruction. How can we instruct students in a way that we meet with them where they're at? That makes sense, right? That you'd want to do that. Although that is a pretty heavy lift for every teacher to make sure they know exactly where every one of their students is at, right? Which did seem a little overwhelming as a teacher at the time. Like, whoa, I got a lot to do if I've got to handle all these different things, right?
Right. You have to know each of your students' styles, and we're not paying you for that.
Right.
You have to teach in each style.
Right.
And just figure out how to do that because you're a teacher.
Right. And boy, when I was a new teacher, I sure had all of my students take Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences test. And I had a spreadsheet where I saw each of their intelligence. I mean, I bought in. I thought it was amazing. And the truth is, I think I was a better teacher because I did that, because then I catered to all the different learning styles that were in the class, which actually is good learning, as you said earlier, Amy, to learn in multiple modalities and particularly visual and verbal together. So I ended up being a good teacher. But when we study specifically, if someone's learning according to their learning preference, do they actually learn it better for the long term? And the answer is no, that is not true.
It's
Okay.
a really important distinction, right? Because this is a neuromyth, and I think many of them will have the same trait, that have what I think it was Stephen Colbert referred to as a certain truthiness.
Truthiness.
It sounds eminently reasonable that people would all learn in different ways and all that. But right, how do you evaluate whether it's true or not? You test it. You test to see if students are actually retaining information and can retrieve it upon command when they learn through different modalities.
Yeah. And all of the tests, I think neuroscientists are actually really sick of this sticking around, because they're like, can we test other things now? Let's not test learning styles. But it really is true that people learn best when we focus on proven techniques that work for all brains, not just techniques that work for specific preferences. And I'm not going to get into all those studies now, but it is fascinating to see.
That is fascinating. What else are neuroscientists studying and debunking? Like, what are some other myths that are hanging around that need to be knocked down?
Yeah, well, the one that I know, that it was actually the first one that I heard, and I'm guessing probably even before learning styles, the first one you heard, is that we only use 10% of our brains. Have you guys heard that before?
I have heard that.
I've seen plenty
I
of
believe
movies based on the
Yeah.
premise of what would happen if you unlocked the other 90%.
Actually, that makes me feel better about myself. It's only the 10%. The other 90% is awesome. You just haven't seen it
Yes,
yet.
I just haven't unlocked
The
it.
sleeping giant.
The sleeping giant.
Which you're joking, Amy, but I do think that's why we want to believe
that. We
myth
want to believe
like
that.
this.
Yeah. We've only tapped some of our potential, is what it really speaks to.
Yes. Even though that
that's
word
not true, is what
potential-
you're saying.
Right. It's not true. And also, I think the word potential is a really harmful, actually, when it comes to self-esteem and ourselves, not to mention our students. But in my research about the origins of this myth, I found it particularly interesting. And of course, we don't know exactly, but here are some guesses, because it's an earlier one. But first of all, there was some early research that scientists misunderstood, because when they started looking at the brain, it looked like there were inactive parts of the brain. And actually, those weren't inactive. Their function was just misunderstood. So it was just a clear misunderstanding as we're starting to to take images. So that's one of them. But there was an author and a philosopher, William James. You may know that name. And he had a very famous claim that people rarely reach their full potential. And he wasn't referring to brain science, but a lot of people assumed he was, or that this myth of the 10%, they linked these two pieces of information.
But he didn't explicitly connect the two.
No, he didn't.
That's so weird.
That is interesting, right?
He didn't. At least as far as my research is concerned, he did not. And then Albert Einstein, a quote was attributed to him that he never said, that used the word 10% and claimed that people only use 10% of their brain. And so somehow that collided, but he never said it.
Mike, this strikes me as a test prep professional, Gretchen. This is the kind of stuff that when you're reading on a standardized test, these mistakes we make because we take things out there and we try to connect them, but they weren't actually what was said. So this reminds me of something you might see as a wrong answer for a reading question on an SAT or ACT.
But this would make a great passage.
Yes, exactly what.
So, all right. So that's fascinating. Throw out a couple of quick ones that we can't talk about right now, but we'll come back to. What are some other neuromyths that learners and teachers should be looking out for?
Yeah. So people are either primarily right-brained or left-brained.
Heard that all the time, yeah.
I always thought I was more right-brained and was very proud of it. Now it turns out that's not true.
I think it's true. But, well, that's...
Another more recent one related to executive function is that multitasking improves our productivity and efficiency. We all think that, oh, if I multitask, I can get more done.
That's a lie a person tells himself. That's not an
Yes.
actual.
Well, but what's
Nobody who
funny,
knows the education is teaching that.
well, I think though, interesting about multitasking is I think we're now existing in a universe much different than obviously, let's say, for all of us when we graduate from college, where multitasking is everywhere, meaning there are so many things to pull us, distract us that I think, we'd like to think, right, that it's productive to do five things at one time. I think actually, Gretchen, we might have done an activity in something you did where you had to task switch or something, and then you realized that you weren't productive. And I was like, oh my gosh, this was a demonstration that I was like, I got it. Now I understand why, yeah, my multitasking is not, when I'm being productive. Right.
I love all that. Let's get to the heart of why we're even talking about this. Why, Gretchen, is it so destructive to not just believe, but actually incorporate these neuromyths into learning?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk. We're all here to help students. So there's a lot I could say in the bigger picture, but let's just get granular there as far as kids are concerned. The best way to learn anything is through retrieval practice and multimodal learning. And so when we are told or we find out, oh, I'm primarily a blah, blah, blah learner, then the impulse when we study is to learn through that lens only. The other impulse is to get pissed at the teachers for like, well, they don't teach in my
ammunition
learning style.
against teachers is what it really is. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's removing a certain amount of agency.
Yes.
Say, well, I couldn't learn that because I'm a visual learner and you said it. You didn't show me a picture that I could associate, something like that.
Right. And the reason I call my work anti-boring is we're teaching students how not to bore their own brains. And the way to not bore your brain is to let it, I was about to say, use its full potential. Use all of it.
Use all 100%.
But we do want to have visual images and connect them to words in our notes. We do want to test ourselves to see what we know and what we don't know. Testing ourselves doesn't include looking at your notes and saying, oh, that feels accurate. It includes, and I'm covering my eyes right now, trying to pull it out of your brain to see what you remember and what you don't. And anytime with students or with myself, when I have made people practice retrieval, there's always a moment, if you slow it way down, you ask a question, and then the next emotional response is like deer in headlights, or like, oh shit, or oh, I don't know that, or I don't, but then if we stick with that moment, it dissipates a little bit and we start thinking or talking or writing, getting the idea out. And then we realize we know something about the thing. And then, oh, if it's a mistake, even better, because I'm like, wait, crap, that's a mistake. What's the actual thing? And then the brain becomes curious about how to fill in the blank. And so by pushing through that effort at the beginning and going through the rest of the process, we are building a stronger, wider pathway in our brain for long-term retention. That's what learns better, not if I do that kinesthetically or verbally or whatever.
Yeah, you're describing the testing effect, right? You're describing the impact of retrieval practice. And I had a terrifying thought as we were discussing it, that what if 20 or 30 years from now, people are talking about how spaced repetition is a neuromyth, right? What would we do?
No. We know that's not possible, right?
I know. Okay, so how do we know that's not possible? I want to kind of pivot to the final point, which is, how can you differentiate a neurotruth from a neuromyth?
Well, I mean, you could, if you wanted, to just go straight to ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT.
ChatGPT is subject to its own hallucinations.
It is.
The truth. Yeah.
It is. It very much is. But that can get you started. I find in some ways it gets me started for my research, and then I go off and I research it in other places. But what we're looking for these days is studies that actually test the specific effect, and not just one study, but multiple studies. And these days, there are also meta studies on learning styles, as an example. So you could ask ChatGPT or put into Google, what are some of the best meta studies about learning styles, and then you can, or put those into Google Scholar, even better, and then read some of the abstracts about them.
Mhm.
That's a really great point. We're not just relying on anecdotal or personal experience. We are looking not just at single studies. We want to see multiple studies. Your point about meta studies, very well taken, right? Like there should be a body of research. If it works, there's a body of research supporting it,
Correct.
especially in an area as sparse as psychology and education. It just feels like that there are only a few things that ever bubble up into the public conscience at once, right? We had our grit moment, and we had our growth mindset moment. Like we have these things, and it's not like the physical sciences or the life sciences where the research and discoveries are fast and furious. We're just looking over what we think we know and testing it. And there's abundant research, I think, for things that work, like spaced repetition, interleaving,
There are.
the whole suite of real learning strategies.
Well, I think that the dilemma is just that, in psychology, what we're talking about, people they always want to provide their own anecdotal support or to something. So if they hear it, it sounds right because something happened to them, right? I think that's where a lot of this has gotten perpetuated, and it's wonderful that we're recognizing that these are not the truths that we should be pursuing in our educational endeavors or our attempts to sort of work with kids and help students, right?
Right.
Love it. Well, listen, it is obvious, Gretchen, that we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, so happy to be here. I'd love to be a regular guest. I'll just say, tell me something to go research. I'll research it. I'll come back.
You've already baited the hook, as it were.
You did, yes.
There are neuromyths that we didn't cover yet, so we're going to have you back soon to go over them. Until then, if listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, my website, antiboringlearninglab.com. There's a contact form where you can email me directly. There is the free part of our learning lab that you can join, and then you can learn a little bit more about this in there and contact me through that platform. LinkedIn is great as well. I'm really making friends with a lot of the cognitive scientists that are doing the research these days, and I repost all that. So Gretchen Wegner on LinkedIn is also a good place.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Test and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.